I had this shamanic experience. Red mushrooms with the white dots that you see in fairy tales all the time. LSD, I think, is the most psychoactive chemical ever found by an order of magnitude. The Amazonians had to find these two plants that were widely separated geographically. I have taken extremely high doses of psilocybin. Like 4 doses is enough basically to knock you out of your body. I wouldn't recommend it casually. I took 7 grams 3 times. And I had this shamanic experience. It was unbelievable. And I don't even know how, I have no idea how to make sense of. In this visionary experience, I could feel my consciousness go down these levels of analysis. And I could see things that they appeared to me in my field of imagination. And I looked at them and I thought, that looks a lot like DNA. I do yoga in the morning, Kundalini yoga exercise, and I've done it for about 20 years. And I learned a long while back that when yogis are practicing their asanas, these positions, that's not yoga. They practice the asanas because they're postures that stretch you. And then once they get to master them, they basically do an exploration of their body for places of discomfort and use the asanas to heal. And you might say, well, what do you mean heal? And well, my experience is that if I move my head, for example, down like this, I'll have a pain manifest itself in my back where I'm tight. And then I can pay attention to that and loosen the musculature, and then the pain will disappear. And as I've been recovering from my last illness, I've been doing this quite a bit because my body is full of knots and pain of all sorts, and I can explore them and do something with them. And I actually think we can also do that to each other to some degree. We do that. Massage therapists are very good at that. And I think it's part of an elaborated grooming knowledge. But what that means is that internally, at least, whatever my consciousness is can apprehend these places of trouble that are physiological.
Yes.
And that I can explore them. And the question is, well, how deep depth? First of all, what is that exploration? There was a man, a mycologist, who was a banker, who went into Mexico and found a woman practicing shaman who used psilocybin mushrooms, and she agreed to let them try them. And that was one of the, Soma, he wrote Soma, very famous book on Amanita Muscaria. I can't remember his name at the moment. Wasson, that was Wasson. He was the first person. He introduced psilocybin mushrooms into Western culture. And like, we weren't ready for any of that. And certainly we weren't ready for LSD. These are unbelievably powerful pharmacological. Like LSD, I think, is the most psychoactive chemical ever found by an order of magnitude. It just takes a few million molecules to produce an intense psychedelic experience. In any case, Scandinavians either used Amanita Muscaria, those red mushrooms with the white dots that you see in fairy tales all the time, same color as Santa Claus and his flying reindeer, and reindeer like Amanita Muscaria mushrooms, by the way. So do flies even, weirdly enough. But I think the Scandinavians also used psilocybin. Now the question is, what the hell's that tree? If you take it seriously, and you should take it seriously. I mean, these images were used for a very, very long time, and people thought about them very hard. So imagine that, well, first of all, you could imagine that the tree has this resonance as a sacred item, partly because we've had a relationship with trees for maybe 60 million years. Our ancestors lived in trees for a long time. And you hear these psychologists talk about the African veldt as our uber environment, that we're adapted to. It's like, well, it kind of depends on your time frame. That's 5 million years. Trees, that's like 50 million years. So the notion of the tree, that's in there. And all of our cathedrals have a tree-like architecture. And the light through the stained glass windows, that's, I think, and this is speculation. I know it's speculation. I understand this perfectly well. It's clear that our consciousness can move up and down levels of analysis to some degree, and levels of nervous system creation and repair. So imagine when you're writing, you can attend to a letter or a word or a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph, or you can move your level of apprehension up and down from the micro level to the more macro level. And, at the highest level of your consciousness, you can apprehend the most general ideas, and at the lowest level, very specific motor movements. So if you're typing a word and you make a mistake, you don't fix it conceptually. You move your finger and fix it. And so that's kind of where it grounds out. And so our consciousness sort of grounds out at the bodily level, at the level of voluntarily adjustable micromusculature, and then at the high level, at the highest level of abstract concept. So it can move, this consciousness. Well, the world tree is a vision of the microcosm to the macrocosm. The tree is used as a metaphor for that. It's sort of a proto-scientific idea, intuition, of the idea that there's a kind of dimension that constitutes zooming in on things right to the smallest possible level of apprehension and zooming out to the most general level of apprehension. Dust particles to cosmos, let's say. Well, psychedelics seem to expand that capacity so that consciousness can move up and down layers of apprehension that aren't available to consciousness under its normal conditions. And there are good accounts of shamanic experiences, and they're very strange. They're very well documented. The shamanic experience involves a death, and then, past the death, the capacity to move up and down this microcosmic to macrocosmic realm in a way that doesn't seem possible under conditions of normal consciousness. And so...
We're rattling around again.
Well, the question is, how far down the levels of analysis can consciousness go under extreme conditions? And so, and I said this was speculation, but I've seen these they're often dual entwined serpents. They're very common. In fact, I have one made by an Indian carver, a Canadian native carver in my, it's so cool. It's called a seasoodle. I have it up in my 3rd floor. It's set on 2 totem poles. There's a man in the middle. There's a serpent on both sides of him. And I asked him what this image meant to his people, because he's still part of an unbroken tradition. He said they had a myth that something alien landed on the earth. It was this seasoodle object. And that when it was rolling down the mountain that it landed on, it took the form of all the things that it encountered. And so, well, like I said, this is in the realm of wild speculation. But I know what Crick thought about the origin of DNA. Well, he thought it was too complex to have evolved. I think that under some conditions, vision can expand to the point where they can see down into the micro level. They can apprehend the micro level consciously. So even at the level of initial detection, most of what you see is memory. And that memory inhibits the novelty response. And the novelty response, this is part of the reason I got interested in mystical experience. The novelty response is twofold. It's not just anxiety. It's also exploratory curiosity. And that's because when there's something novel, well, you have to be careful because God only knows what it might be. Like it might be the thing that kills you. It might be nothing. So anxiety freezes you. But the hypothalamus, which sits right on top of the spinal cord and is the highest integrating center of the instinctual responses of the motor system. It's way precortical. It's divided into 2 parts. And one part of it governs the dopaminergic system that mediates incentive reward, so all positive emotion, but more importantly, active exploration. And so what happens if you hit something that's novel in relationship to the notions of preconceived regularities? Positive emotion is disinhibited. That's exploration. And negative emotion is disinhibited simultaneously. And there's a man named Rudolf Otto who wrote a book called, I can't remember the name of the book, but it's not Varieties of Religious Experience because that's James.
William James.
Anyways, he described the primordial act of perception as numinous, mysterium tremendum. And it's a combination of positive and negative emotion. And I thought, that's pre-latent inhibition perception. Psychedelics disinhibit latent inhibition of perception. And that's why they produce a mystical experience. But the mystical experience, I mean, there's three aspects to it, let's say. There's an overwhelming positive emotion. Simultaneously, there's overwhelming negative emotion. And that's like an awe experience. And then there's the disinhibition of fantasy simultaneously, which is something like the attempt to map that. And so people find that, well, absolutely overwhelming. But by definition,
Yes.
It is overwhelming, literally. Now, you might say, so I'm going to answer that snake question. That's what I'm trying to do, I studied one symbol, which was the Scandinavian world tree symbol. And so the Scandinavians thought that there was a tree at the center of the cosmos. They called that Yggdrasil. And on the outside of the tree, there's a snake that eats its own tail. Now, the Amazonian jungle dwellers who discovered ayahuasca have the same image. It's exactly the same. It's a tree at the center of the cosmos with a snake that eats its own tail. Now, ayahuasca is a very bizarre chemical, and no one has any idea how the natives synthesized it. Ayahuasca is a combination of DMT, which is an extremely powerful hallucinogenic that only lasts 10 minutes, and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which makes the DMT experience last 8 hours because monoamine oxidase inhibitors stop the breakdown of DMT, which is a monoamine. The Amazonians had to find these two plants that were widely separated geographically out of like hundreds of thousands of plants, and they had to mix them together and they had to boil them properly for a certain amount of time to make ayahuasca. Well, they've been using ayahuasca probably for like 15,000 years. Now, the Scandinavians didn't use ayahuasca, the ones who came up with the world tree.
15,000 years?
For 15,000 years, yeah.
In Amazonia?
In the jungles. Well, they got there about 15,000 years ago. Now, maybe, we don't know how long it took them to discover it, but in most of those relatively primordial and small tribal groups, the pattern is unbroken oral tradition. Like, they're not transformative societies. They do pretty much what their ancestors did.